February 16, 1943. Klaus Hermann, an engineer at Oberg, opened the metal case of the screwdriver with a little shaking. American radio set was taken. Around him were 5 of the best radio engineers in Germany. They leaned forward, eager to look at the tools they had found during the recent battle at Kasserine Pass. They had been told for 3 years by Berlin that American technology was not as good as German technology. Junk that a country of store owners and assembly line workers made. What they did. The Radio Intelligence Service said that American troops were using old instruments and simple designs, and operators who aren't taught well. Still, something was wrong. The Allied forces kept in touch all the time over impossible distances. Their ships always kept in touch. Their ground units, organized with such accuracy that it looked like something much more complex than the simple radios. German propaganda was talked about. When the case was opened, an SCR-508 was inside. A radio set that was taken from a destroyed American M4 Sherman tank and was still working was the mountains in Tunisia. In the next 72 hours, Hermann and his team found out. Would break every assumption German military leaders had about the United States' ability to make things and use technology. The level of difficulty and the direction of the war. The math behind radio transmission was about to show. The truth is more devastating than any loss on the battlefield. The careful study of American gear would. Not just a gap in technology, but a huge one in industry as well. It was already planned for Germany to lose. The frequency crystals, automatic circuits, and methods for mass production that the Reich could never hope to beat. The taking began on February 14, 1943. In the Kasserine Pass, General Erwin Rommel's troops went on the offensive against inexperienced. In terms of strategy, American troops had won. They had pushed the U.S. Second Corps back 50 miles and destroyed it. More than 100 American tanks. German technical intelligence was found in the ruins. Teams moved quickly as they looked for guns, papers, and tools that might show what the Allies can do. Hetman Friedrich Baer was in charge of assigns. A group of intelligence officers belonging to the 21st Panzer Division were given clear instructions to take any American radio devices without damaging it. East of the pass, in a crater, his team found a Sherman tank that had been left behind. A German 88mm gun had destroyed the turret, but the radio section was still there, amazingly not damaged. On the inside, Weyaber found not 1 but 2 full radios. The SCR-508 was made for transmission between tanks, as well as an SCR-510 radio. Both were whole and had there are still crystals, wires, and even the technical manual in their mounting brackets. Baer right away ordered the equipment was sent to the closest German technical facility because they knew this finding could be very useful. Information about how the United States can communicate. They were brought to Technical Testing Station 12. On February 16th, hidden in an underground building under Tunis is the facility. Germany's best radio engineers lived there. These were the men who built the Wehrmacht's own communication systems. Oberengineer Klaus Hermann, who used to be the chief designer at Telefunken, led the team that did the test. He had with him experts in making signals, circuits, frequency generation, and manufacturing methods. Ability to think. They started with an outside check. The radios in the U.S. were putting them in heavy-gauge steel cases that are painted olive drab and have rubber gaskets on all the seams to protect them. Adapter. In his first report, Hermann said that the quality of the building was better than anything he had seen in German. Military tools and gear. The bags were made to last through water, dust. There was shock and high heat that would damage most German radios. But it was when they opened the cases that the first shock hit. Everything inside was standard, flexible, and made for making a lot of them. Each part was exactly the same as what was described in the technical instructions that came with it. There were no manual adjustments, expert marks that showed which tuning to use, or other changes that would need to be made. Skilled putting together. This was equipment that was meant to be made by millions of semi-skilled workers in plants that could be spread out over an entire continent. Leighton Hans Schreiber, an expert in control of frequency, looked at the crystal units that set the radio's working bands. He had planned to find easy, cheap crystals, maybe even old ones that people have already broken. Various parts. He instead found precise quartz crystal clocks. Each one is ground to within a few parts per million and sealed tightly in metal cases. Requirements that would have needed weeks of work in a lab in Germany. The SCCR-508. 10 crystal-controlled channels were inside. Each crystal comes in its own package, can be switched out, and is marked. Details about the exact occurrence. Schreiber did 2 counts of the crystals. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. In Germany, crystal-controlled radios were only used by high-level command units and airplanes because they were too expensive and hard to find. It might make sense to use accurate crystals. 10 crystals were put into this basic American tank radio. Like light bulbs or nothing. He carefully took out one rock and looked at it. Under a microscope. The quartz was perfect, the wires were lined up perfectly, and the frequency was marked correctly. One of these crystals would have cost more than the whole German FUG-5 radio set in. Tools and work. The Americans, on the other hand, put 10 of them in every tank radio and had already made. There are a lot of Sherman tanks. The first look the team did turned up even more troubling information. The radio, FM frequency modulation, was used instead of amplitude modulation. AM, which was used by German radio. In theory, FM was better because it provided background. It allowed for free contact and interference-free operation, but the circuits had to be a lot more complicated. Accurate control of the frequency. German engineers thought about using FM in the military, but decided not to. It's expensive and hard to use in the field. Then there was this FM radio that was widely sold, put in a tank that young American troops drove. Automatic frequency control, AFC, was shown on the circuit board. Circuitry that kept the radio on the same frequency without having to be adjusted all the time by hand. German radios are needed. Workers have to keep tuning to account for changes in temperature, worn-out parts, and power supply issues. Various kinds. It looked like American radios could tune themselves. Oberingenieur Hermann began writing his first report to the high command of the Waffen-SS in Berlin. The words came out. Slowly, each word going against years of propaganda and spy reports. It was written that Germany was not as advanced in industry as the United States when it came to radio. What was included were made with such accuracy that they needed special facilities, trained workers, and quality control systems. That just didn't exist in the Reich. It was even worse that the radio was. This is definitely not a prototype or a model made in small numbers. It looked like it was made by a big manufacturer in every way. A huge number of Americans were making these radios. In the next 3 days, the team carefully checked every feature of the radios they had seized. They hooked up the tools to electricity. The basement lab was full of test equipment, antenna systems, and supplies. What they found out with each test made them feel even more scared. The SCR-508s. The transmitter sent out 25 watts of clear FM sound on any of 10 channels that could be chosen. Ways to get. The mechanism for choosing stations was beautiful, reliable, and didn't need any technical know-how to work. A tank captain only had to turn a knob to choose a crystal that was already there, and the radio switched channels, retuned its circuits, and kept the quality of its transmissions perfect all by itself. To change frequencies on German radios, a trained operator had to physically adjust many controls, replace coils, and tune the tools again for a few minutes. Even more was shown by range tests. That's weird. The team made touch with a monitoring station 20 kilometers away using an American whip antenna that they had stolen. Away. There was no static on the FM signal, and it came through clearly. German AM connections were getting messed up, even when they tried to introduce electrical noise from a tank engine. The FM radio's limiter circuits got rid of the noise and gave a clear signal. German controllers could only dream of having sound like that. Lieutenant Schreiber focused his look at the circuits for the crystal oscillator. He tracked down every part. Every voltage was measured, and the plan was written down in great detail. What he found proof of his worst fears. It wasn't just that the crystal control system was smart. It wasn't possible to copy with the ability to make in Germany. A perfectly cut quartz plate was needed for each crystal oscillator, cut to exact sizes that are measured in thousandths of a millimeter. After that, the crystals were put in sealed gas fill holders with electrode spacing that could be controlled to a level that German companies couldn't reach in, making a lot of them. Frequency stability was kept by temperature compensation circuits throughout operation. ranges ranging from -40 degrees Celsius to +60 degrees Celsius. Schreiber figured out that making one to make crystal to American standards, it would take about 40 hours of skilled worker time in German research labs. 10 of these crystals were put into a single tank radio by the Americans. With thousands of Sherman tanks already built and radios like this in American Jeeps, trucks, and command vehicles, every year, Americans made millions of precision crystals. In his report, he asked the clear question, where did the Americans get enough experts who were trained to make millions of precise radio crystals? The answer is, even more upsetting was when it came from smart people. The U.S. people were not using techs with a lot of training. They made the whole country industrialized. Process. There are new factories in places like Chicago, Newark, and Fort Wayne hired thousands of mostly women semi-skilled workers to run special grinding tools that automatically made crystals. Measurements with great accuracy were made with visual comparators and frequency. Not skilled workers, but counters. Statistics were used for quality control. Random samples were checked instead of looking at each one individually. The Americans turned an art form that started in a lab into an process in industry. When the radio's receiver part was looked at, even more advanced technology was found. The boss. The design of the heterodyne circuit was like that of German radios, but the parts were better in every way that could be measured. Vacuum tubes were made with tighter tolerances and features that were perfectly matched to the circuit needs. German parts could not meet the stability values for capacitors and resistors. The receiver was made so that it could be aligned by technicians with some experience using simple test tools, instead of radio experts who have been trained for years. The modular building was the most upsetting thing. Each major system part, each transmitter, receiver, power source, and control unit could be switched out on its own. Without tools or technical know-how, a tank team could quickly take out a broken unit and put in a new one. Being aware, damaged units would be sent back to the depot to be fixed or thrown away. This method required huge industrial ability to make extra modules, but it meant that American tanks kept the lines of communication open. Skill to work in conditions that would make German vehicles' radios silent for days while technicians did work in the field. Fixing up. The team looked over the technical guides that came with the radios. These papers, which were printed on nice paper and had simple, clear diagrams and directions, assumed that operators had not much technical knowledge. There were only numbered steps left in the operating processes. Use of troubleshooting tools. This is a choice tree that any soldier could use. The maintenance directions gave exact times for replacements for parts instead of depending on the operator's judgment. It occurred to Herman that these guides told us as much about the way Americans think about business as the radios themselves. The Americans knew that soldiers on the front lines were not experts. To avoid having to train every radio operator to learn about technology, they made tools that any soldier with a moderate amount of intelligence could use. Keep up by following easy steps. For this, more advanced tools were needed. But it solved the most important tactical problem: how to keep talking while in battle. German TV sets, on the other hand, needed trained operators who knew about radio theory, could fix things in the field, and had the technical know-how to keep tools that acts up working. These workers had to go through months and years of experience. It was impossible to replace them, and when they were hurt or killed, their gear often became. Whoever got it didn't use it. By the end of the third day, every route had been written down by the examination team. The American radios that were taken were broken down into their individual parts, and their functions were tried. The report they gave to Wehrmacht High. There were more than 200 pages of technical research and photos to back them up. Schematics, circuit designs, and part lists. The findings were very sad. In some important ways, American radio technology was 5 to 10 years ahead of German devices. How often? Changing the frequency, crystal control, automatic frequency circuits, and modules. Construction had basic advantages that could not be beaten by better strategies or skilled operators. Read more. Importantly, American radio technology was made from the start to be mass-produced. The design was based on an industrial theory that Germany did not have in any way. Report by Herman. Germany was thought to need to build 30 new specialized plants, train 50,000 more workers, and spend as much money as Lufthansa's total annual budget to match the ability of American radio stations to make shows. There was a lack of raw materials in Germany even back then, especially high-quality quartz gems and some rare things that are needed for precise parts. The decision had to be reached. American business capacity had made technological advantage the deciding factor in war. Berlin got the report on February 25, 1943. It was marked top secret, and only a few high officials were given it. Soldiers who worked for the Reich Ministry of Armaments and the Wehrmacht High Command. The answer was quiet. Nothing new. It was okay to let companies run. There were no crash apps run. The consequences were too terrible to take note of. But the work at Technical Testing Station 12 was just getting hot. In the months that followed, more Germans got their hands on the tools. Each capture showed new proof of American technological and industrial of being better. An SCR-300 radio, which is the well-known bag walkie-talkie, showed FM technology shrunk down to a movable unit that weighed only 18 pounds, but made communications up to 5 kilometers stable. German pocket radios that are range weighed more than 40 pounds and needed add-on battery packs that weighed an extra 20 pounds. ASCR-299, taken in Sicily in July 1943, shocked the people who were looking into it. It was a cell phone, a long-range communication station that is built into a truck and has its own power source. The radio signal. It put out 350 W of power over a frequency range of 2 to 18 MHz, with stability that is managed by crystals and the power to change frequencies in minutes instead of hours. The SCR-299s that went with it had a helichrydine design with 15 vacuum tubes, multiple. There are conversion steps and a crystal filter to make the selectivity better. Long in German. Range communications technology with the same level of power was available, but it was only used in fixed installations that needed it. Satellite systems and power plants the size of buildings. The Americans had packed the same amount of power into a car that could go anywhere and be set up in an hour. After each test, showed the same pattern. American technology was made so that it could be used by people with little training, mass production, by people with some skills, and maintenance is done by following easy steps. English. Skilled operators, trained techs, and electronics experts working in the field were needed to set up and fix the equipment. Experts. One concept was used by millions of units around the world. One did not. The reports on technical information coming from Tunisia, Sicily, and then Italy. Not only individual radio sets, but also a whole way of thinking about contact. The American forces kept through many levels of radio networks. Everyone from the squad level to the theater leadership is always in touch. The platoons had SCR-536. Talking phones. Backpack radios SCR-300 were used by businesses. Battalions had SCR-508 and 608 sets that were placed on vehicles. Some units had SCR-193 and 299 tools for long range. Each level could talk to the levels above it and below, making a web of links that the Germans could not break. More importantly, all American radios used frequency systems that worked with each other. Interoperable tools. One who looks forward and has an SCR-300. An SCR-608 could be used to talk to an artillery company 20 kilometers away, because they both used FM on frequencies that worked well together and had stability managed by a crystal. German troops, on the other hand, ran several radio systems that didn't work with each other because they needed different frequencies and types of modulation, and different ways of doing things. By the summer of 1943, German intelligence had over 50 different types of American military radios have been logged, ranging from small transceivers to command sets that are carried in the air. Based on captured serial numbers and intelligence reports, production projections showed that every month, companies made more than 100,000 military radios. English. Production, which includes all services and types, hit about 15,000 units per month at full power. The inspection teams started to look at captured American industry records, lists of parts, technical orders, and the infrastructure behind American equipment was shown in repair manuals. Standardized parts were used across many types of radio. Vacuum tubes had bases that were all the same. Crystals were held in normal ways. Screws, nuts, and bolts all had to follow the same size standards. Let things be switched around. Because of this standardization, American companies could switch between changes in radio types without having to retool. A factory that makes SCR 508. A few fixtures had to be changed on receivers to make them work with SCR 608 units. And types of parts. Often, parts from one type of radio could be used to fix other types. The method was made to be flexible and expandable. German making things used, on the other hand, custom parts for each type of tools. The FUG-5 radio for tanks. The FUG-10 aeroplane radio, and this one had almost no parts in common, even though similar. Electrical tasks, and each type needed its own production lines and tests. Tools and a stock of specialized spare parts. Because of shifting production goals, tools had to be retooled for months. And training again. Oberg worker Hermann moved to a bigger technical. By the fall of 1943, there was an intelligence center in northern Italy. It spent more and more time studying American ways of making things, not just designing tools. What he sent to Berlin changed from technical. Radio circuits are evaluated and strategic warnings about industry capacity are sent. He wrote about the American. The electronics business is growing very quickly. Businesses with names like Galvin Manufacturing, which became Motorola, had grown from small radio makers to huge companies that work with the military. Helicopters, which makes amateur radio devices, was making high-tech military receivers in numbers that were higher than all of Germany's. Making radio shows. Western Electric, which makes phones for the Bell Telephone Company. System, which ran factories with tens of thousands of people making full radio sets, vacuum tubes, and gems. Not one of these companies had. Before 1941, they were big military suppliers. The Americans had made a whole military electronics industry in less than 2 years by turning civilian companies into military ones, hiring new workers, and using techniques for mass production that have been honed in the making of cars and home appliances. In Detroit's engineers who work on cars came up with radio production lines that were as efficient as car assembly plants. The German radio business, which was based in Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg, stayed the same. Set up the same way it was in the 1920s. Specialized goods were made by small companies. Skilled craftsmen to make the tools. The amount of work done was measured in hundreds per month, not thousands per month. Week. Individual review and hand adjustments, not a statistical process, were used to keep quality high. In charge. Testing by computers. The report Hermann gave to the Reich in December 1943. The American radio industry was called the Ministry of Armaments. A report of industrial capability and what that means for strategy. It gave shockingly detailed information about how American gadgets are made. The United States was making every year what Germany would have taken 20 years to make. It wasn't just new technology. It had to do with business, organization, and ideas. A report said that American companies could make enough military radios for 1,000 divisions, but the Americans only sent out about 90 troops. The extra capacity meant that American troops could get any kind of replacement gear they needed. Radios that were broken were not fixed in the field. They were changed. Old models were taken out of service and sent to training units. It kept coming out with newer, better ideas, but not as prototypes. Mass-produced equipment that was spread out across whole theaters. At the same time, German troops carefully listened to every radio. Field workers fixed things while the war was going on. Conditions, using broken parts from other sets to keep others working. Replacement parts didn't always show up on time, if they did at all. Because of this, newer versions were only made in small numbers. Retooling would make current models produce less. The radios that Vemec made in the early 1930s were controlled by hand. Along with newer tools, making maintenance a nightmare and training a pain. The situation with the crystal supply was especially bad. By the end of 1943, German quartermasters thought they needed 5 million precision crystals for radio tools they already had and made plans to get them. Changes. About 200,000 crystals could be made in the United States every year. It would take over 10 years to make more crystals, even if Germany put a lot of effort into it. To make 5 million pieces. According to spy reports, the Americans were making 30 million crystals every year. They were able to get enough quartz by finding mines in Brazil, and starting mining operations there. Arkansas, and even tries with growing crystals in a lab. Crystals from the U.S. They were not only easy to find, but also of higher quality, with frequency stability that German labs couldn't even measure, let alone make something. When the captured American test equipment was looked at, another size of the gap between industries. Automatic test sets were used in American radio plants to measure frequency, power, and tone, how much production, modulation quality, and sensitivity there is in seconds. These testers were themselves complex electronic tools made in large enough numbers to let every station on the assembly line have test tools just for that. German factories did tests by hand, which required skilled workers and minutes for each unit. One test set that was captured, a signal from the measurements company machine, became one of the most valuable things at the technical testing center. This, a single instrument, which is commonplace in American factories, could send perfectly calibrated messages across the whole range of radio frequencies. Putting it together had cost about $300. The German equipment that was the same needed a lab full of different frequency attenuators, oscillators, and meters, which cost a lot of money and had to be calibrated by experts all the time. By the beginning of 1944, the message, it was clear and scary from technical knowledge. American phone calls. The superiority was complete, unchangeable, and rising. Every month, there were more radios being made in factories than Germany had in its whole force. Every example that was caught showed Germany was unable to make the small changes, design refinements, and production advances that the United States did. Match. When the United States put in place radar systems in late 1943 and early 1944, 1944 made the point even more clear. Radar was in the radio, taking microwave frequencies, pulse methods, and advanced computer programs to their very limits. Handling of signals. The U.S. was making a lot of radar sets for ships. They used the same level of industrial efficiency that they used for voice radios on planes and stations on the ground. A caught one. In March 1944, the SCR-584 fire control radar was looked at. German radar scientists had only thought about the technical skills that were shown. The set worked with the 3000 MHz is a very high frequency. A precise tracking system with automatic following circuits was used and improved their precision so that anti-aircraft guns could destroy enemy planes very effectively. The SCR-584 was over 10,000 pounds and had to be moved with a special truck. Still, a huge number of them were being made in American plants. German radar research had been mainly on long-wave equipment that worked below 1,000 MHz because German companies couldn't make the special vacuum tubes that are needed for higher frequencies. The American magnetron tubes. Microwave radar needed precise cutting, rare materials, and production methods that Germany they did not have. As late as when German scientists created microwave radar systems on paper, but they couldn't be built because German industry didn't have the parts. Through 1944, stolen American equipment was still being looked at in a planned way. As Allied troops moved up the peninsula of Italy and got ready to invade France, every new case added to there is a pile of proof that American technology is better than other countries. Better radios kept coming out. When SCR-694 was released in the middle of 1944, frequency modulation tank transmission that works better and has a longer range. The SCR-619 radio for planes offered hundreds of channels managed by crystals and frequency switching that happens almost instantly. The most important thing is American. The reliability of technology kept getting better. Beginning of production SCR 300 radios sometimes had trouble with battery contacts and water getting in. Late 1944 examples that were captured had new cases, better seals, and changed the wiring so that these problems didn't happen. The Americans did more than just build tools. They were keeping it better by learning from experience in the field and using what was learnt in future production. English. On the other hand, tools often got worse over time. As the war went on, shortages of materials drove people to make changes. Of poor quality parts, skilled workers were sent to fight, and they were replaced by people with less knowledge. Quality control got worse when companies focused on amount over dependability. Radios that were supposed to last for years got broken after only a few months of use. When the invasion of Normandy happened in June 1944, German military intelligence had recorded the full picture of how much better American communications are. When the Allies landed in France, they brought more radios than the whole German army had put together. Every Allied company could talk to the battalion over the radio. Main office. Every Allied company could become the leader of a division. Firearms. Forward monitors could accurately direct fire from dozens of kilometers away because their radios never went out. Talk to. When German leaders tried to coordinate their defenses, communication broke down because of artillery fire, jamming by the Allies, and just the general chaos of the fight. FM radios it worked great on the test ranges, but not at all in battle. Crystal oscillators moved around off frequency in the hot summer weather in Normandy, making it hard for units to talk to each other. Batteries that powered the sets ran out quickly because there were no new batteries available. The network for conversation that the German ideology thought would exist just stopped working when they were in battle. The flow of scientific reports. The tone of Back to Berlin became more and more desperate. Auburn's engineer Hermann is now connected to where German troops wrote in August 1944 that they had already lost the electronic war. American jamming gear, methods for finding your way, and with their signal intelligence skills, the Allies were able to find and target any German radio broadcast within minutes. Radio waves were used to break German codes, listen in on frequencies, and track moves. Analysis of traffic. In late 1944 and early 1945, the last autumn happened as, under Allied bombing, Germany's economic base fell apart. Priority was given to factories that made radio tools. Aims 4. In November 1944, the buildings that Telefunken used in Berlin were destroyed. Lawrence factories in Stuttgart were bombed many times. The factory that made crystals in Sudetenland collapsed. To the Soviet Union in January 1945. By March 1945, Germany was making radio. Had pretty much stopped. Existing tools kept working, keeping up with more and more desperate field workers who used parts from broken sets to make repairs on the spot, with whatever they could find lying around. There were no replacement radios available. When a radio at headquarters broke, leaders could not talk to their units. When the radios in the tanks broke, armored formations broke up into separate groups of cars that couldn't work together. The Americans, on the other hand, even as success got closer, they kept making their gear better. When new radios came out in early 1945, more channels, a longer range, and better dependability. Making things kept running at full speed, not because more radios were needed, but because it was hard to stop an industrial machine. By May 1945, there was a lot of extra radio gear in American stores that would never be used in battle. It was over on May 8, 1945. Germany gave up without any conditions to the Allies. Among the things that were logged, these were the technical intelligence reports from Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy that the occupation forces used. These German authorities kept these papers very secret and hid them in salt mines and underground archives. Allied detectives who had a unique view of the tools they used. American tech teams are looking. People who went through German sites in the summer of 1945 were shocked to learn how the Germans had carefully looked over the American radios they had seized. The accounts were correct, full of information, and done by professionals. They were right when they said that American technology was better, and honestly judged that Germany couldn't match American strength. One report made by Klaus Aubrun, an engineer, Hermann in April 1945, as the Soviets closed in on Berlin, was his last act. Proof of the technical war. He wrote that Germany would lose as soon as German experts opened the gates. Tunisia caught the first American radio station. Crystals for frequency, automatic circuits, and a flexible design showed an approach to business that Germany could never match. The Americans had turned war into an industry, using methods for mass production on all parts of military gear. Hermann came to the conclusion that future wars would be won not by the side with better forces or better strategies, but by the side with more factories. Make an incredible amount of high-tech tools. Germany had great fighters and smart leaders, and the right strategies. What Germany didn't have was an industry base that could compete with American production. This lack. Teenage girls were able to round something as easy as a radio crystal to very exacting standards in factories that made millions of pieces every year, while German labs were having a hard time making. The fate of the thousands of German engineers who looked at captured American tools after the war showed what the New World Order really means. In 1946, American officials hired Klaus Hermann, and he worked for them for 2 years. German radio technology was written down for U.S. spies. After that, he worked as an advisor for American. They worked with electronics companies to help them understand and improve German ideas that were worth keeping. A lot of his co-workers went in the same direction. Operating as planned, the brain drained from Germany to the United States. Paperclip and other projects like it brought thousands of German engineers and scientists to the United States. They knew about German technology, but what they really learned were American ways of running factories, techniques for mass production, and the way of running a business that made the American victory unavoidable. In 1952, Hermann wrote a technical study called Comparative Analysis and put it in the Institute of Radio Engineers Proceedings. Of the ideas behind German and American military radio design from 1939 to 1945. The paper was based on his time in the war when he looked at captured American weapons that was written up in academic language what he had told Wehrmacht High Command almost 10 years before. It was an American radio design. Wrote, put reliability, ease of making, and ease of use at the top of the list. Under any circumstances, regardless of how complex the technology is or how well the parts work. German design looked for technical, excellent work, theoretical perfection, and cost-effective parts, given that skilled operators would work around the limits of the equipment. One idea was applied to millions of units and a worldwide operation. One did not, though. The paper had to be turned in. Reading in military schools and technical schools. It changed the lives of a generation of Americans. There were engineers who made tools for the computer revolution, the space race, and the Cold War. What was learned? From looking at German engineers to looking at American equipment, looking at both shaped American AIDS technology lead for decades. Around the 1980s, a lot of German experts who had worked in people who worked in technical intelligence during World War II got together for reunions and historical talks. They talked about the past, shared notes, and thought about what they had done. He was in his 70s at the time. Talks about the work he did looking at American radios that were seized in Tunisia and Italy. At a meeting in Munich in 1986, he showed pictures of the first SCR-508. In February 1943, his team looked into it. They showed young German engineers leaning over the open radio case, counting circuits, writing down parts, and trying to figure out what was going on. What they saw? Hermann told his listeners that as soon as they took out the first crystal holder, they saw 10. He knew that Germany had already lost the war when he put precision oscillators into a normal tank radio. The noise level, a small quartz chip that had been ground to exact measurements, was used as the crystal, where physics, engineering, and business organization all meet. In general, it wasn't a very complicated gadget. Any lab with the right tools could make one, but to make millions of pieces to a standard level of quality with perfect interchangeability at Germany had to build an industrial system that made radios cheap enough to be put in every military radio. Did not have it all. The American infrastructure built from 1941 to 1945 did not fall apart. When the battle was over, it grew and changed, making transistors. It was integrated circuits, microprocessors, and then computers and information systems that made the present world. The same companies that made a lot of radio crystals for Sherman tanks also made microchips for home computers, semiconductors for space missions, and the parts that made global talking on the phone. What German engineers learnt by looking at American tools. Tunisia became an important part of the birth of modern technology. Plan for production. Set a standard. Various parts. The people who run trains just test things as they go along. Make a lot of things to meet the need. These ideas can be seen in every part of American radio. The way that high-tech companies worked after using equipment in World War II became the norm. The Smithsonian Institution opened in 1995, 50 years after the end of the war. Communications and Victory. The Radio War in 1939 to 1945 is the name of the show. There was an SCR-508 tank radio on show with a serial number that matched the Oberring. Hermann looked at the unit in Tunisia in February 1943. This radio was found in German archives and brought back to the U.S. as part of a culture exchange, a program. Along with the radio, the exhibit showed parts of German technical intelligence reports that were turned into English and showed how the investigation was done and what was found. People could learn what Herman has to say about the quality of crystals, the design of circuits, and the level of sophistication in production. They were able to check out pictures of German engineers measuring parts, checking circuits, and writing down information. What the show made. It's clear that German technical experts saw that the Americans were better and told their leaders, and they knew what it meant. There was also German radio equipment on show as a comparison. The American SCR-508 was next to the FUG G5 tank radio, letting you compare things visually. The German radio was bigger, heavy, and harder to use and less capable in every way that can be measured. It stood for excellent engineering is limited by the ability of the industry. The American radio made a good impression. Engineering times the number of industrial tools that are available. The notes from the librarian said that the show wasn't meant to praise or criticize American or German technology. Both sides had skilled engineers who made tools that worked well within the limits of their teams. What was different? Not smarts, training, or theoretical understanding. What made them different was industrial theory and the ability to make things. Americans made systems that worked efficiently when only a few people were in charge, users who have been trained. The Germans made systems that worked great when they were run by highly trained professionals. One way to do it grew to a world war. One did not. The last thing in the show was a small glass case with a single radio crystal that was taken from the SCR-508. Looked at in Tunisia, the diamond, which was about the size of a postage stamp. Precisely cut quartz in a metal case that keeps out air and water. The sticker said that this crystal was one of 10 that were put in. In an average American tank radio, it would have taken about 40 hours of skilled German labor to copy. During the war, Americans made more than 100 million of these diamonds. That would have meant that every radio worker in Germany had to work for 500 years. Over 200,000 people saw the show over the course of a year. Many were soldiers who had used the radio gear that was being shown. A few were engineers, interested in the past of technology. Some of them were scholars who were studying how war affected industry. Everyone left with getting a better sense of how industrial capacity affects military results. He passed away in 1997 at the age of 84. An obituary in the Spectrum magazine of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers talked about his work with. As a technical intelligence officer in World War II, his work with radio technology, and his work after the war, helping American businesses understand German new ideas. In his obituary, it was also said that he always insisted that Germany's loss was decided not on the battlefield but in plants, not by soldiers but by production workers, not because of mistakes in strategy but because of mistakes in operations. Having limits, he gave over to the Deutsches Museum in Munich as part of his papers. 2,000 pages of scientific reports, circuit diagrams, and part lists, and analyses of strategies that were made between 1943 and 1945. These papers gave historians a lot of information about how German technical experts saw American, what they reported to Wehrmacht High Command, and the gear they used. The most moving piece of paper in the collection might have been a letter that Herman wrote to his wife in April 1945 as Berlin was falling. The Soviet forces. A few months before, he sent his family to stay with cousins in Bavaria. Stayed in Berlin to do final technology checks until they were told to leave. He wrote in the letter that he was about to get caught by destroying all the secret papers and tools. He thought about the last 3 years. Time looking at American gear, from the first SCR-508 in Tunisia to the newest radio sets that were found in the Ardennes. In every case, he wrote, proved the same result. Not only did America have better tools, but an incredibly different way of fighting. They had turned everything from radio crystals to whole armies using the same idea of mass production that was used to make cars and fridges. Berlin. He wrote that had tried to use craftsman skills to fight an industrial war. It wasn't that German tech was not as good. In many areas, German theoretical understanding was better than American. But ideas alone don't win wars. The ability to make things wins wars. The group that can Will you build more guns, planes, radios, and everything else? No matter how skilled or brave an opponent is, you will finally be able to beat them. At the end of the letter, he made a statement. If there was another war, it would be even more economic than the last. The winner would be the country that could make the most things, the most cutting-edge technology, and the power to make an unlimited number of precise parts. Between 1941 and 1945, America had shown that it could do these things. Any future enemy would have to be as strong as or stronger than the United States in terms of economic power, which Herman thought was impossible for any one country. History showed that he was right. The next war, the Cold War. During World War II, factories, new technologies, and production skills were put to the test. The ability, even though the area had a lot of resources and people, could not compete with the United States in making electronics, computers, or automating factories. In 1943, Herman found a gap in radio crystals that later grew to include semiconductors. There are integrated circuits and microprocessors. The story of how German experts looked at captured American radio equipment is a story about industrial war and the change in industry that led to it. Happened in the United States during World War II. It's about how war changed from a mainly male activity to a female one. Tactics, training, and bravery to one that is based on industrial capacity, level of technological development, and the efficiency of production. The frequency crystals that Herman and his co-workers found so interesting were not magic. It was high-tech engineering. Yes, but what was more important was that they were made with exact engineering on a large scale. American business had. They learned how to make millions of pieces that were all the same, which had never been done before. Before on that size. This skill that was created for radio crystals was later applied to every part of military equipment and, finally, every consumer good that the United States made. What I learned. The things that German engineers who looked at American weapons in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy learnt were harsh but clear. It doesn't matter how good the equipment is if it can't be made in large quantities. Technology that is very advanced is. It's not useful if users can't depend on it. Excellence in theory is. It's not worth anything if manufacturing can't do it reliably. When industrial power is organized and directed correctly, beats all other things. These lessons, which came at the cost of Germany's loss, are what modern. A strategy for making things. Plan for output. Make sure quality is built in, and train users well, support tools well, and adjust to demand. The same rules that were used to make American radios during World War II are now used to make everything in the world. Obering engineer Klaus Hermann opened a case in the beginning of the story. Captured radio case in Tunisia in February 1943 changed the way countries did business forever. Get ready for war and fight it. That little radio crystal, quartz that was carefully crafted, became a military icon of the Industrial Revolution. It stood for the moment when winning stopped being based mostly on battlefield skill and started being based on factory goods. The German experts who looked at American gear saw this change happen and understood it. Not only did their reports list detailed details, but they also wrote about the end of one type of war and the start of one more. They saw, thought about, and wrote about the future of war. The fact that no one paid attention to their warnings in Berlin didn't change how accurate they were. The rules they follow today. Discovered, making a lot of precise parts, automating factories. Standardization so that parts can be swapped out, and design so that they can be made, and are important to all high-tech industries. The straight line goes from microprocessors were made from radio crystals that were ground in American companies in 1943, made in Asian foundries in the 21st century. The idea behind industry stays the same. The only thing that's different is the size. The technicians from Germany they didn't just look at the American radio equipment they had taken in 1943, devices for communicating. They were seeing the future of war, technology, and how businesses are organized. During the war, their thorough reports were kept secret and filed away. Eventually, these reports became historical records that not only why Germany lost, but also how the strength of an economy affects the result of modern wars. Even though it was written in complicated wording, it was clear that Germany had challenged it is the world's biggest economic power, but it can't make enough things. The radio crystal, which is ground quartz. The whole story was told by an oscillator made by young American girls in numbers that Germany could never match. Business. Wars need factories that can make things. Without it, no amount of skill in battle. Victory can be achieved through new technologies or by being brave as a person. That lesson, learned by German engineers looking at American radio equipment in secret labs all over occupied Europe, still applies today. In this day and age of microelectronics, satellite phones, and computer-controlled, despite war, the basic truth has not changed. The side with more. The ability of industries to make huge amounts of high-tech tools will win out in the end. From 1941 to 1945, the Americans proved that idea. The world has been getting used to what it means since.